Reading the Megillah and the ceremony that we started at 7, so please find a moment to return them here up front. And the other is, if you have a cell phone, as I would imagine most of you do, please turn it off. Or at the very least, if you're on call or something, silence it so that we don't have a whole orchestra going off in the middle of the program. Okay? Thank you. The evening is dedicated to the Warsaw Ghetto, marking the 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began on April 19, 1943, as we know. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is perhaps the most written about single event in the Sho'a, and the Warsaw Ghetto, everything that happened in the ghetto, including the uprising, alongside Auschwitz, those two places are probably the most written about places that relate to the Sho'a. In fact, until the late 1960s, the majority of all the literature written on the Sho'a, whether it was academic scholarly research or memoir material or diary material, whatever it was, or literature of different kinds, the majority until the late 60s was about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Since then, there's more variety. There are many reasons why that is so. As we know, the Warsaw Ghetto was the largest of all the ghettos. The uprising, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, was the first urban uprising in Europe by anybody against the Germans. The Jews couldn't wait till others were going to liberate their country. By the time others could liberate the country, of course, the Jews who had the idea of an uprising realized that all the Jews would be dead. So the Jews, in a sense, in all of that, as a community, as a collective, were on their own. Not necessarily because everybody's an anti-Semite, some were, some weren't, but because their time frame was different from everybody else's, and they needed to react in one way or the other and deal with the Nazis well before others found it to be the right moment for their national uprisings or whatever they would engage in. This evening, we will be looking at the Warsaw Ghetto and at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from several angles that are, I would say, somewhat unusual for at least people who are not the narrow circle of experts on the subject. There are 20 of us or something in the world who are experts on the subject about the Warsaw Ghetto, a little more maybe. But other than that limited circle of people, some of whom are sitting here, we're going to be looking at angles that relate to the Warsaw Ghetto that are really different from what we normally encounter. First, we're going to be looking at the ghetto through the eyes of someone who was then in the ghetto, a young girl, one of the many civilians, not one of the rebels with arms, but one of the many civilians, as the majority were, of course, civilians as in any society. The majority of the people are civilians and not those who take up arms, whether in undergrounds or in armed forces. So we'll be hearing from someone who was a young girl and a civilian and who got out just before the uprising and survived, thank God. We'll then have a look at some of the lesser known fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and contacts with the Polish undergrounds, the very Polish undergrounds, from an expert on that subject. And finally, we'll be looking at the narrative of the uprising through what is arguably the most iconic photograph of the Warsaw Ghetto and perhaps of the Sho'a, the famous picture, of course, of the boy with the raised arms surrendering at the end of the uprising. And we'll have a look then at various angles of the narrative of the uprising through that. The civilian perspective on the Warsaw Ghetto, and as I said, they, after all, the majority, is a perspective that is reflected in several publications that have come out recently, some published by Yad Vashem, others by other places, and I want to share with you, relating to the uprising aspect of the Warsaw Ghetto, a few sentences, each from two diaries, written by civilians in bunkers during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. As far as I know, these are the only two known diaries, at least that have been published, by civilians, written in real time during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And therefore, these offer us a very unusual insight and window into the ghetto. The first that I want to read a few sentences from is by an anonymous teenage girl. We think that it's a teenage girl based upon the language and the context in which this was written in Polish. She was hiding out in a bunker at Mila 32. We all know about Mila 18. So she, not a fighter, was in a bunker with dozens of other Jews in a hot, stench-filled, smoke-filled bunker with numerous other people until they had to escape because of the attacks on May 10th of 1943, and we assume that she did not survive. And she writes, "I go out into the street, it's burning. Everything around is on fire. Whole streets, Mila, Zamenhof, Kuzha, Nalewki, Lubeckiego. Shortly put, all the streets are burning. The entire ghetto is a sea of flames." And I'm skipping down to the last lines. "People are suffocating because of the smoke. All shout for help. Many, almost everyone, call upon God. God, show your power. Have mercy on us." God is silent as a sphinx and does not reply. "And you, the nations, why are you silent? Don't you see how they seek to destroy us? Why are you silent?" That's the end of the diary, at least the end of the part that survived. There are indications that there was a whole section before the uprising that did not survive. We don't know the name of this person, and our assumption is that she did not survive. There was no indication that she did. The second diary that I'd like to read from is from this book, which was published by Yad Vashem a few days before Pesach in Hebrew. Part of it was originally written in Hebrew, part in Yiddish, part in Polish. It's a book called Ha'od Yivatel Mi She'yivkeh, and I'll read the official translation rather than translate on my own. "Will anyone be left to cry? Diary and writings of a family from the Warsaw Ghetto." The authors are Kopel Pizhitz and his daughter Mira Pizhitz Flint, married to, after the war, with the name Flint. And I want to read, I'll be translating from the Hebrew, so I'm really doing it injustice because the Hebrew is a translation from the Polish. But I apologize, I wouldn't bring the Polish here and translate freely from that. I want to translate the last few lines of the diary from the Hebrew to English, so bear with me if the translation into English doesn't quite flow. And this is the end of the diary, although in this case, unlike the first case, the writer, thank God, survived. And she writes, "Starving and living in disquiet, we lay down on our cots with the intention of sleeping that night, except that the inexplicable feeling of disquiet, of tremendous disquiet, that was a portent, as though a portent of evil things about to happen, prevented us from sleeping. Sleep would not come. Somewhere in the middle of the night, Schmidt and Chersky woke us up, 2 other people in the bunker. This is a bunker also with dozens of people. They too could not sleep on their cots. They climbed up to our upper level of the bunk, because on our side, the ceiling of the bunker was higher, and there were bunks that were two bunks high. And that way, whispering, they began to weigh the different possibilities, the different paths for getting out of the bunker and for rescue. And we spoke about this all night until the morning. The 4th day of our stay in this bunker, they had entered the bunker not on the first day of the uprising, but several days into it. On the 4th day of our stay in the bunker, Rotblatt, who was the organizer of the bunker, came and told us that in the afternoon, the Germans were going to come and try to root out all the bunkers. And therefore we had to take into account that they might be throwing grenades in order to cause panic, and in order to cause the people who were hiding to reveal themselves. "Remember well," said Rotblatt, "keep an eye on the children. Watch out. Make sure that they don't cry out, because that can bring a terrible tragedy." and that was the end of the diary. But Mira Pidgeot's and Kopel Pidgeot's managed to get out. They found with the help of other people, they found other hiding places, and they survived. This evening we're going to have 3 speakers. I'm going to introduce each one individually, and then I'll tell you their names, but we'll tell you about each person individually, and we'll have time for questions and comments at the very end. The first speaker is Ruth Berlinger, who is a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, the mother of Nomi Stahl, a member of our synagogue, and the youngest member of the Pidgeot's family. Kopel was her father, Mira was her older sister. And Ruth will share with us some of her personal story. Our second speaker will be Dr. Lawrence Weinbaum, and our third speaker will be Dr. Dani Porat, also a member of our synagogue, but details about them when I call them up. And now I'd like to give the floor to Ruth.